Hello and welcome to this Bournbrook podcast. Today, in another of one of his many interviews with influential American commentators, Bournbrook columnist Guy Denton talks to David French, who currently serves as the senior editor of The Dispatch and is the author of a number of books, including most recently 2020's Divided We Fall, America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation.
I'd like to begin by asking about your background. You began your career as an attorney, served in the Iraq War, and have been a prominent commentator for several years now. Can you provide an overview of the contours of this very unique professional journey?
Well, it's what happens when you spend your whole life not knowing what you want to do when you grow up. So I went to law school after college. I had no long-term plan to go to law school. This was something that I kind of fell into because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life when I graduated from college. Law school gave me new options. And so I went to law school. I didn't really have a plan with what I wanted to do in law school. I kind of defaulted to the easiest thing after I graduated, which was becoming a commercial litigator at a big law firm. But while I was in law school, I just became fascinated with constitutional law and began, even as a young attorney, to do First Amendment work, constitutional litigation, mainly on a pro bono basis. And I just kept doing more and more and more of that until 2004, where I realized that I either had to decide whether or not I was going to be a commercial litigator with this really expansive First Amendment hobby, or if I was going to be a constitutional litigator or constitutional advocate full time. So I jumped ship from the private practice world and entered the world of constitutional litigation and constitutional advocacy full time. And then at the same time, I got really convicted that I couldn't keep supporting the Iraq War without being willing to serve myself. So at age 37, I enlisted in the Army, in the Army Reserve, went to officer basic course, became a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General, and Army lawyer, and served in Iraq during the surge from 07 to 08. And so these things were happening parallel. I was doing constitutional litigation and constitutional advocacy. At the same time, I'm doing my military work, and then also began to do more and more writing about all of those things. And by 2015, after litigating for 21 years, after being in the reserves for, I just gotten out of the reserves after being in the reserves for 8 years. I thought I wanted to make a change. And so I moved from litigation and into journalism. And that was the month before Donald Trump came down the escalator. And so that meant I've been really, really, really busy ever since.
You picked an auspicious moment for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. How has the time that you spent in the military influenced your patriotism, your conservative sensibility, or even the manner in which you commentate?
You know, it's influenced me a lot on every aspect of my life. I mean, my wife will say I've been two different people: the person I was before I went to Iraq and the person that I've been since I came back from Iraq. And that's been for good and for ill. But, you know, I would say one of the things that serving in a place like Iraq does during the height of the surge, it gives you an awful lot of perspective. It certainly gives you a lot of perspective on domestic political disputes. And I've told this story a number of times, and I'm kind of telling the story on myself. And Iraq is really when I began to get, after Iraq is when I really began to get very focused on the problem of American polarization. Before I left for Iraq, I was at a conservative convention, and I was just speaking, feeding the crowd some red meat, and somebody asked me a question about why I was a First Amendment attorney. I ran a group called the Center for Academic Freedom, where I was litigating at college campuses on behalf of mainly conservative and conservative Christian organizations that were facing First Amendment problems. And someone asked me, why did I join the military, and why was I doing both these things, this conservative litigation and my military service? And I said, I believe that the two great threats to America are jihadists abroad and radical leftists at home. And I feel called to fight both of them. Well, everyone liked that answer. They thought that was great. And then I went overseas and I saw what jihadists do. And I felt ashamed of that answer, because to even compare, like I went to law school at Harvard, I taught at Cornell, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Ithaca, New York, are very, very hard, hard left communities. But, I gave birth to my son in Ithaca. I didn't give birth. My wife gave birth to our son. That's
so would have been quite the feat.
Yeah, wow, that would have been something else. My wife gave birth to our son in Ithaca. We had kids in Ithaca. I had a great life in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Yeah, I disagreed with the people around me. I disagreed with the politics and many of the policies, but I had a really good life in Massachusetts. I had a really good life in New York. I lived in Midtown Manhattan. I lived in Center City, Philly. All these places are 80, 90% Democratic. And I had a good life. And then in the jihadists, I would have no life, there. And I saw, the unbelievable, hideous things that they did to their fellow human beings. I just felt ashamed. Like, I felt ashamed that I'd even used those two groups in the same sentence, And so I came back with a really different perspective. Not that American constitutional and political disputes aren't meaningful. It does matter a lot whether the First Amendment contours are larger or smaller, the contours of due process rights are larger or smaller, tax rates are higher or lower. These things matter. The defense budget matters, but they're different category. They're just a different category from the kind of existential differences that I saw and encountered in the conflict in Iraq. And so I got really concerned when I came home and I began to see people using almost sort of existential threat language to describe policy differences, and then to impute dramatic moral differences based on those policy differences, and in the rhetoric of dehumanization and alienation. And so that's when I got to be very concerned with American polarization.
Well, I'm sure that perspective has played quite the role in shaping the work you do at the Dispatch. And I'm curious, as a senior editor there at the publication, what have you really hoped to accomplish with starting this new website in the middle of a very febrile time? And how have you tried to distinguish it from other outlets in terms of its content and its presentation?
Yeah, one of the great drivers of polarization in the U.S., and there are many, I'm not going to say this is the main, but there are many drivers of polarization. One of the great drivers of polarization is a media environment that's dedicated to hot takes, that's dedicated to clickbait, that is dedicated to sort of rapid response to allow you to sort of reinforce your priors rather than question your assumptions. And this is characteristic of a large section of the American media. There are many great conservative journalists at conservative publications, but conservative media by and large is known for sort of the outrage cycle and the clickbait cycle. And so what we wanted to do was just kind of zig where everyone else was zagging, if that makes sense, to go in an opposite direction, to really focus on extended, more, we call it fact-based reporting and analysis, taking a pause from the outrage cycle, providing a closer look at complex phenomenon that are defining our society at this time. It's just kind of pressing the pause button and saying, hey, let's take a deep breath, let's step back, and let's take a look at what is really happening. And I think that is, we're not the only voice doing that, certainly, but we need voices doing that. And so that's been one of the really enjoyable things about my time at the Dispatch. And we're conservative, but we're not partisan. In other words, we don't view ourselves as like lawyers for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. we have a conservative mindset, a conservative sensibility, but we do our best to call balls and strikes on all sides.
One of the quirks of today's atomized media space is that it has never been easier for individuals to completely isolate themselves in echo chambers by only consuming commentary or news from particular sources. How concerned are you about this trend, and what can we do to address it?
I'm very concerned about it, to be honest. I've got a book coming out September 22nd called Divided We Fall, plug.
We'll come to that, don't worry.
Available on Amazon. But anyway, I'm very concerned about it. One of the drivers of American polarization, and one of the drivers of American division and hostility, and almost every divisive negative cultural movement in the U.S. is this sort of groupthink. I use in the book a concept developed by Cass Sunstein that hasn't gotten enough attention in the U.S., and it's called the law of group polarization. And what the law of group polarization does is it says when like-minded people gather, whether it's in person or virtually, the common expression of their shared view gets more extreme. In other words, let's say you and I got together with 3 other folks over dinner, and we're talking about gun rights, and we're all supporters of the American Second Amendment, and which protects the right to keep and bear arms. When we reinforce each other's points of view, we're going to leave that dinner more committed to our position. It's just common sense. This is the way it works. Now, that might be different if we have 1 or maybe 2 people along who disagree with us, who test our assumptions and push back. But when like-minded people gather, they get more extreme, they get more entrenched. And so what we're seeing is not just an online phenomenon of this, as we kind of silo ourselves into our own news bubble, but we also are seeing a real life in-person reality here, because people are clustering and living in like-minded enclaves in the US. And so this is a lot of human nature. You like to kind of be, especially as things get more intense and more polarized, it's hard to be in an environment where everyone disagrees with you. I live in a very pro-Trump area of the United States, and I'm not pro-Trump. I'm, one of these never Trump conservatives. And, it's an interesting experience interacting with virtually everyone around you who is firmly committed to supporting Donald Trump. And they know that I'm not. It's an interesting dynamic. So we cocoon ourselves online. We cocoon ourselves in the real world. And when we cocoon ourselves, we not only grow more extreme, we often get more wrong about our political opponents, because the negative view of our political opponents gets constantly reinforced.
How do you feel about social media? Has social media exacerbated this problem? And how in recent years, since you've been very active in commentary, has it really affected things in that regard?
Well, I think we overblame social media. That there are existing divisions that in some ways social media can exacerbate. But phenomena like the Big Sort, which is a book written more than a decade ago about how Americans were beginning to move into different, physically move into more like-minded enclaves, that began way before social media. If you look at the growth of negative partisanship in the US, which is the phenomenon of people being a Republican more because they dislike Democrats than because they like Republican ideas, that's a phenomenon that began well before social media. So many of these negative trends began before social media. And last time I checked, Twitter didn't exist in 1861 when America faced its most dramatic schism. So I do think we overblame social media, but and we also can't use social media as a broad sweep that they're all the same. They're different. Facebook is different from Twitter, is different from Reddit, is different from YouTube. But I do think one thing that social media does is it puts human nature on blast. Whereas for good and for bad, for good and for ill, I mean, we'll see positive stories go mega viral that you'd never have heard about before, heartwarming things. You'll also see negative things. And one of the negative things that you encounter in social media is, it used to be, if there was a guy 5 doors down from you in your neighborhood who was cantankerous and angry and furious at everybody, you might never know it. But if somehow he follows you on Twitter, or you make the mistake of making him a Facebook friend, you suddenly know all about what he thinks. And you can't, and it's, you have to take affirmative steps to sort of silence that, to mute it or to block it. And so I think what's happened is we're now getting a much greater sense, for good and for ill, of what our neighbors believe and what our neighbors are like. And it's not always great. It's not always great.
Well, we touched upon your new book there, but in broad terms, for more brazen promotion perhaps, what inspired you to write the book, and what is its thesis?
Yeah, so what inspired me to write the book is essentially what I began to see after I came back from Iraq. I began to see such increasing intensity in polarization that it made me worry about the future of our country. That the existential threat to our country isn't the bad policies of Republicans or the bad policies of Democrats. It's the enmity, it's the hatred between Republicans and Democrats. And I began the book by reflecting on what I learned watching the Iraqi civil war unfold. And that is, when you saw Sunni and Shia fight it out, yeah, there were policy differences between Sunnis and the Sunni, the Sunni preferences for Iraqi government and Shia preferences for Iraqi government, oil revenues, divisions of power, et cetera, et cetera. But that was not the cause for the bloodletting. The cause for the bloodletting was the sense of grievance and vengeance that this person, the Shia killed my uncle or the Sunni killed my nephew. And you had this narrative of atrocity and grievance. And then, and it was also, heavily geographically concentrated. There were Sunni areas, there were Shia areas. And what I began to see is between red and blue in America, in many ways, a lot of times the policy differences were just beside the point of our conflict. Instead, we were drawing on senses that they hate me. And here's the evidence that they hate me. They did this, and they did this, and they did this. Like if you talk to a conservative right now, or a Republican, a very Trump-supporting Republican, they will have a list of grievances against Democrats. Look at what they did to the kids from Covington Catholic. Look at what they did to Brett Kavanaugh. They've inspired violence against Republican congressmen. Their far left people are burning cities. And each one of the things that they can list are true events that have occurred. And you talk to somebody on the left and you will hear, a very similar list of grievances. I mean, look, what you have had is a rise of an alt-right that has turned into outright terrorism. What you will see is the separation of families at the borders and an intentional act of punitive cruelty to children who were, brought to the United States through no fault of their own. And you can go on and you can say, these are all things that actually happened that have inflicted harm on people, and they provide the energy for the conflict. And then I went and I looked at a broader view, and what you begin to see when you look at a broader view of the United States right now is that there is no single important cultural, political, or religious trend that is pulling Americans together more than pushing us apart. America is becoming more secular, but not all in the same places and not all at the same rate. So you have a very hyper-concentrated segment of Americans who are deeply religious in certain parts of the country, and a hyper-concentrated segment who are secular in other parts of the country. We're less likely to live around people that disagree with us than any time in modern times. I mean, I can just go on and on and on. We don't even watch the same stuff on TV. It's like the last unifying thing that we all watch is NFL football, and now NFL football is contentious. And so what I said was, we cannot take for granted the idea that a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, continent-sized republic will stay together forever. I mean, the union between the UK and Scotland is older than the American Union, and it came reasonably close to coming apart.
May do so again very soon.
May do so again. Not too long ago. Unions are not etched in stone. And so what I wanted to do was to say, essentially this: look, we have got to start realizing that our hatred for each other is its own threat to this nation. And I wanted to show people why it's bad and why it's not going to get any better reasonably soon. Then I wanted to show people this is how we could actually break apart. So I have some scenarios in the book where demonstrate how we could actually break apart. And then the last part of the book is, here's what we've got to do to stay together. And I think it's past time for American leaders, both political and cultural, to put a premium on American unity and American, not nationalism, but even just something as simple as fellowship. That we we have appreciation and respect for the basic humanity and the most fundamental rights of our fellow citizens, and we will respect those and we will protect those. And one concept I articulate in the book is that it is absolutely vital that we defend the rights of others that we would like to exercise ourselves. That's a basic building block of our society. If we can't do that, we've got real problems.
How extreme is the polarization of the current moment relative to the sort of polarization that Americans have experienced at other points in the nation's history?
Well, it's the most extreme it's been in modern times. Okay, so, the U.S. Union is much more fragile early on than a lot of Americans seem to remember. I mean, there was even a secession convention during the War of 1812. I mean, it didn't really go anywhere. It was, not all that potent. But, America was founded with a fundamental flaw, and that fundamental flaw was legal slavery. And that created a huge cultural, political difference between two segments of the United States of America, the North and the South. And that was going to have to be resolved. They could not continue. It was so fundamentally in tension with the American founding that it had to be resolved. And it was ultimately resolved in a dreadful civil war. Well, so I'm not saying we're there. I'm not saying it's 1859, 1860. But what I am saying is empirically, there is more hatred and enmity towards each other than there has been in modern American history. And at least I would say a century. And that this hatred and enmity can be an existential threat to our democracy. And then this mistrust and this hatred and enmity is all out of proportion to the actual stakes of our political disagreement. That's what's ironic about it. I mean, 1859, 1860, 1861, the stakes were incredibly high. I mean, could human beings be enslaved by other human beings? Those are extraordinarily high stakes. Right now, our stakes are not as high. And yet the enmity is just volcanically erupting in our culture. And we cannot just assume that our leaders or ourselves, that we will respond to that with wisdom and temperance and reason, as opposed to fury and anger and impulse.
You have spoken about how the shared experiences of the American people might help us bridge the current divide. Could you elaborate on that idea?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to do is to go forward, we have to go back. And to understand the founders actually had quite a bit of wisdom.
Believe it or not.
Yes, they were also flawed. I'm not denying that there were flaws in the founding. I mean, in the founding, the Constitution is not the Bible. It's not a God-breathed document. There are flaws. Our founders were had flaws, but they also had a lot of wisdom. And one of the things I point to in the book is James Madison's Federalist Number 10, the 10th Federalist paper, the best Federalist paper. And what he essentially says is the founders were not at all oblivious to the risk of what they called violent faction. They did not see that the union of those 13 colonies was in any way inevitable or perpetual. And they could foresee threats to unity. I mean, how could they not? Because the early United States had multiple different religious factions within it. And remember, at that point, they weren't that far removed from the wars of religion in Western Europe, where many of these same religious factions duked it out in a conflict that on a per capita basis was not exceeded for sheer bloodiness until like the World Wars. So they knew of the potential for faction. And one of the things that James Madison said is, in essence, the way you deal with faction is to allow many factions to bloom. The way you deal with the threat of violent faction is pluralism. allowing many different factions to have their place in this country. And this was also echoed in a lot of George Washington's writings. Almost 50 times he used a particular phrase from the book of Micah in the Old Testament, and it was repopularized by the musical Hamilton, where he said, every man should sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And he used that phrase with the Hebrew congregation in Rhode Island, writing to America's Jewish Americans and saying, you have a home here. You have a home here. And a big part of the American experiment has been trying to extend that reality to more and more American communities. So obviously excluded from that, the scope of that concept were African Americans, for Black Americans who were enslaved at that time. But part of the American hope for the American experiment is that we can say to Black Americans, you can sit under your own vine and your own fig tree and no one will make you afraid. To, in marginalized community after marginalized community. But instead, what we seem to be doing now is to say, that is a principle that applies only to my community, and that I want to dominate, I want to defeat, I want to humiliate, I want to drive from the public square those who disagree with me. And that's not tenable. That is an approach that is not compatible with the American experiment.
What are some of the other ways, perhaps, in which this fundamentalist malaise might be overcome? Through recommitting to institutions, possibly, by some sort of cultural shift, or even by perhaps the emergence of a particularly unifying political figure?
Well, you can't plan on a unifying political figure.
If only.
Yeah, he would say, here's my 1-point plan for national unity, a generational political talent. That would be nice. I think that could have a lot of impact if you had a transformational political figure. I don't see one coming. And one of the difficulties of negative polarization is, if a charismatic, unifying, transformational political figure comes from a particular political party, he's going to have to overcome the automatic negative reaction of his citizens. Ronald Reagan didn't have to deal with that. The negative polarization of 1980 was a fraction of the negative polarization of 2020. So putting aside the transformational figure, I think there's two things that really have to happen. One is we have to rediscover tolerance. And I don't mean tolerance in sort of this hard left way in which I learned about tolerance in the academy, which is, I'm very tolerant of people who think like myself. But true tolerance. And I lean on a concept or a post from a guy who blogs under the name Scott Alexander, a pseudonym. And he said it very well. And he said, he speaks to his progressive friends and he asks them, are you tolerant? And they say, yeah, absolutely, I'm tolerant. I love people regardless of whether they're Black, white, gay, straight, cis, trans, you name it. And Scott says in response, well, what's wrong with Black people, gay people, trans people? And they say, what are you talking about? There's nothing wrong with them. And he says, well, then what are you tolerating? Because tolerance implies, right, something to tolerate. And that's what we've lost in this country. We have lost a sense of tolerance, that even if there's somebody who I know, who I profoundly disagree with, or has real flaws, or believes things I think are bad, am I able to not just tolerate them, to actually defend their liberty? So that's sort of an individual obligation, this individual obligation to say, I have a sense of shared citizenship with and obligation to people who disagree with me. So that's an individual. The other thing is, how do you translate that into a political program? Well, one of the problems that we have right now is we have a political system that is so broken that a huge percentage of Americans will never cast a meaningful vote in their lives in a federal election. And we have federal power so concentrated and so strong that millions and millions of Americans don't have a realistic prospect of creating a community, a political community that reflects their values. And so what I say is we have to rediscover federalism. We have to rediscover a principle that says, if I'm a citizen of a particular state or a particular city, that I have a fundamental right of self-governance. And if California wants to create single-payer healthcare and wants to be a sanctuary state, then that's up to California. If Arizona wants to be more restrictive regarding immigration and have more restrictive immigration enforcement, for example, then that's up to Arizona. That we have to have decentralization of American governance. And we have to realize that the centralization of American governance was kind of a artifact of some pretty unique times in history. The Great Depression, the existential threat of World War II, and the existential threat of the Cold War. Those things have faded. And now we're left with this increasingly diverse country, but with an increasingly centralized government. And those things are incompatible, I believe. And it's one of the reasons why we continue to raise the stakes of every presidential election. If you're around here, you know that every presidential election is the most important election of our lifetimes. And that has a destabilizing effect. But there is this kernel of reality in there, that is that as the executive branch of the US gets more and more powerful, it is true that every election we elect the most powerful peacetime leader in American history to govern an increasingly diverse and divided country. And I think my argument in my book is that's got to change. We have to give people meaningful votes over their own lives to govern their own communities. And if we can't do that, we're going to just keep going down this road.
On a different, although perhaps no less depressing note, how do you feel about the current state of the Republican Party?
The current state of the Republican Party right now is broken. It's just broken. And I think one of the key pieces of evidence that it is broken is that for its 2020 platform, it declined to adopt a platform. Instead, it said that it's just going to adopt whatever Trump's agenda is. And so then Trump puts out a series of bullet points. I mean, not even a platform, just a series of bullet points that was his agenda. And some of the things were just sort of like aspirational promises, not statements of principle. And a party that is not organized around specific ideas is in kind of a fundamental way is a broken party. A party that's organized around a person, especially a person that even if he wins is term limited, is going to recede from the scene, is anyways, I think a broken party. I hope, the United States needs a healthy right and it needs a healthy left. It needs them both. No single American political movement has a monopoly on truth, and any unopposed political movement is often unable to see its own flaws and weaknesses. So we got to have a healthy system, two-party system. We're not really made for a multi-party system. We don't have the same structures that you guys do. There are reasons why we've been pretty much two-party from most of our history. But we need a healthy two parties. And the problem is right now is that Trump is such an overwhelming presence in the Republican Party. And he's not just an overwhelming presence in the way Reagan was. Reagan was and still is an overwhelming historical presence in the party. Trump is an overwhelming bullying presence in the party. He's phenomenally punitive against those who would dissent. And so what you have is an atmosphere of fear that in many ways pervades large sections of the party. And then again, that's not healthy. That's an evidence of brokenness. So you have a party that is dedicated to a person rather than an ideology or a series of ideas. And that person is extraordinarily punitive. And you have an atmosphere of fear. Now, Trump won in 2016, and a lot of people would say, well, it's proof it works. I mean, we'll see in 2020. But over the long term, I just don't think that's a very compelling formula. And a lot of the numbers bear this out. I mean, even when America was pre-pandemic and our economy was reasonably strong and we're reasonable, not entirely at peace. We still have troops deployed in combat, but mostly at peace. His approval rating was bumping around at 42, 43%. That's not normal. That's not normal. It would be normal for a president in peace and prosperity to be at least above 50%. And so I think there's a lot of brokenness in the Republican Party. And there's also, kind of a lot of really gross dysfunction at the edges as well, with the spread of conspiracy theories like QAnon. But that's not to say the left is healthy. There is a strong illiberal strain on the left right now that is threatening important institutions in the U.S. and this sort of hyper woke illiberal intolerance that is choking out a lot of free inquiry and free thought in important American institutions is a real problem. I mean, there is a brokenness on the left. They don't have to deal with a figure like Donald Trump on the left right now. But there's a lot of smart people on the left who are really worried about this. I mean, if you saw the letter, the Harper's letter, signed by a bunch of left-wing luminaries, intellectual luminaries, the launch of a new publication called Persuasion from my friend Yasha Monk, who is trying to really preserve free inquiry on the left. If you've, Heterodox Academy, started by Jonathan Haidt, which is mainly professors who are left-leaning or fully on the left who are trying to preserve free inquiry in the academy. There's a lot of signs that there is a hard left that is deeply intolerant. And in fact, that's the motivating force behind the Republican Party right now, is opposing that hard left.
How might the Republican Party be revived then as a vehicle for principled conservatism?
You got to beat the bully first. You got to beat the bully. The bully can't keep winning. I mean, that's like the first thing. The way I look at it is there's kind of three scenarios coming out of the 2020 election. A narrow and surprising Trump victory, because he's the underdog right now. So if he wins as an underdog, pulls off the surprise victory, he's going to be the Colossus astride the land. I mean, he will have proven that not just Trumpism, but Trump is the way to win. His kids are going to be the heirs apparent to his legacy. And if not his kids, then sort of his imitators in the media. He will define the GOP for the foreseeable future. If it's a narrow Trump loss, you're probably going to have a strong argument that his sort of vision of hard-edged nationalism, populism is still the way to win, but he was maybe an imperfect messenger, that he tweeted too much, or, he squandered, some of his advantages by his personality and temperament, and that there's sort of the vision forward for the GOP as a Trumpism 2.0, maybe a Trumpism with more disciplined tweets. But the nationalism, populism, I think, would still be relatively ascendant. If he's beaten badly, in my view, at that point, all bets are off. All bets are off. I don't know what the Republican Party would look like if he's beaten badly. I think then you'll have a real intellectual, ideological free-for-all as to who will and who should emerge as the next standard bearer of the Republican Party. And we honestly won't know what the Republican Party looks like or stands for until 2024. But in the meantime, just expect a lot of conflict within the GOP. But it could be healthy. It could be a lot of, you could have some real introspection. You could have some people who have felt silenced through intimidation, speaking up to describe what Trump was actually like. And I do think if he's beaten badly, you would see some floodgates open as far as sort of, former administration officials beyond even what we know now. There would be a very different view in the Republican Party of the history of the Trump era.
Are there any issues on which conservatives, like those at the Dispatch or like George Will, for instance, might find common ground with a Biden administration? Or are both sides in this coming election just absolutely unappealing and beyond hope?
Well, the very interesting thing about negative polarization is that what Trump advances something, the Democrats reject it. Or if Trump rejects something, the Democrats will embrace it.
Hmm.
And this has had some pretty interesting effects, for example, in foreign affairs. I'm somebody who is a very big believer in American alliances, NATO, our alliances in Asia. And as Trump has tried to reject those and to pull back from those, the Democrats have been much more willing to embrace them. Not that the Democrats were, really anti-NATO before, but to see the Democratic Party embracing these webs of alliances that have kept the peace for decades, I think is very, very important. It's a general matter. Trump is sort of so all over the place that it's sort of, there is it's kind of hard to precisely track how Trump has impacted Democratic ideology. But I do think the Democrats are just more left as a party. I don't think that's controversial to say. They're just more left than they were. And I'm not more left, so I don't agree with the Democratic Party. There are elements there are things Biden will say or do. I very much agree with Biden's decision to try to run as a unifier. I very much agree with Biden's decision to try to display real empathy and bring a sense of empathy into American public square. There are things about Biden's manner and approach to this election that I like. I appreciate that Biden won the primary by defeating the harder left elements of his party. I appreciate that he's continued to fend off the harder left elements of his party. But on vast majority of policies, I don't agree with Joe Biden. So there are things I appreciate about him, but on substance, I disagree with the vast majority of his platform.
The conservative movement has always been very much strengthened by its own intellectual diversity. But what do you think are some of the key principles, ideas, or beliefs that should unify all principled conservatives, regardless of their particular disposition?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say there should be unified. What should unify us is a defense of the principles of the American founding and defense of the Constitution of the United States. Let's just start there as a baseline. Sort of a defense of classical liberalism itself. Now, there's increasing disagreement within the quote right about classical liberalism. Patrick Deneen has questioned liberalism. Sohrab Ahmari has questioned liberalism. Adrian Vermeule has questioned liberalism. There is a faction on the right that questions liberalism itself. But I think a conservative party that does not defend classical liberalism and the principles of the American founding just isn't. In what sense is it conservative? What is it trying to conserve here? It's more of a revolutionary movement, a right-wing revolutionary movement. I don't consider that to be recognizably conservative, and I don't consider my arguments with illiberal folks on the right to be intramural. We're not on the same team or side. If you're opposed to the classical liberal vision of this constitutional republic. So I think that is something that I think is absolutely foundational. Now, also, I think that it's social conservatism, a dedication to life, religious liberty, a dedication to religious liberty is implied from a support of the American Constitution and American founding. But life and religious liberty, I think that these are elements that are critically important to a conservative movement. And I also think critically important to absolutely vital to the healthy conservative movement in the United States is a deep sense of personal and communal moral commitment. Because one of the things about conservatism is that we are suspicious, rightfully so, of the power of a large state to foster human flourishing and to perpetuate civic virtue. We're very suspicious of this for a lot of good reasons. But that means that there are voids, so the left will say, I have a way of preserving and protecting the least of these in American society. And that is with large scale government intervention. One of the conservative responses to this traditionally has been, one of the ways, the most effective way to take care of those who are most vulnerable and hurting in American society is by we do it. We do it. Our churches do it. We do it as individuals. We love our fellow man, and we extend ourselves through civic associations, through institutions, through individual effort to uphold and mentor and protect and take care of people who have, who are have less privilege than we do. Not to say government has no role, but it's absolutely vital. The virtue of the American public is absolutely vital to the health of the American Republic. And a conservative movement that can't bring that to the table is not a conservative movement worth following. I think of the foundation of American liberty. It's really ordered liberty is the right phrase. So you have on the one hand, the obligation of the state as aspirationally articulated in the Declaration of Independence and operationalized in the Bill of Rights is the preservation of liberty. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the aspiration. The Bill of Rights operationalizes that. So the state is obligated to protect liberty. But as John Adams said, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. And so a conservative movement that doesn't value that moral rectitude is not a conservative movement worth following. And that's one of the great tragedies of the Trump moment. We have become a conservative movement. You've heard the phrase, perhaps, virtue signaling, which is
regrettably, yes,
yes, empty virtuous arguments. Well, we now have a conservative movement that, in many ways, is vice signaling. It's demonstrating its aggression to no end. It is demonstrating its dishonesty. It is demonstrating its pugilism. When moral rectitude should be at the very heart of it. And so that's a defense of classical liberal values, a defense of a deeply moral and altruistic movement. I think that's what conservatism should be.
I always like to end on a lighter note. I am merciful in that way. Specifically, what are some of your favorite books, and what books would you say have had the greatest influence on your outlook?
Yeah, that's a great question. Edmund Burke, Reflections of the Revolution in France. A number of fiction books have really influenced me. So I'm going to nerd out here. My favorite Tolkien work is The Silmarillion. After you slog through like the first 50 or 60 pages, I think it teaches a number of really deep and profound moral truths. A short little book that has had a deep influence on my life, The Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis. Another huge fiction tome that has had a lot of influence is War and Peace, and Tolstoy's exploration of the human condition and amidst the trauma of war. Incredibly powerful. So, I could go on, but I would say I've actually been more influenced intellectually by fiction than I have been by books of philosophy, although I found them, obviously influential. Heck, if you were going to also make me keep going in the nonfiction direction, I would say read the Federalist Papers. But that's the constitutional lawyer in me. So those are a few. Well,
lastly then, aside from, of course, Divided We Fall by David French, what might we be reading in the present moment to survive this interminable period of quarantine? Have any good books caught your eye lately?
I tend to read, I tend to veer between fiction and history. So I just finished The Splendid and the Vile, Churchill's early years in World War II. Found it interesting. I wasn't as in love with it as I have been some other books. I actually just reread, and this goes back to our offline conversation that we had about my Anglophilia, in spite of the fact that I haven't been to England very much. Just finished Bomber Command again for the second time. Fascinating look at the British war from the air in World War II. But as far as what should you read about what's happening now? The answer is obvious. TheDispatch.com
Of course.
Yes, thedispatch.com. Sign up. You can sign up for free and you'll get a portion of our offerings, or you can pay $10 a month and get all of it. But yeah, we'll be your guide through a perilous time.
That is a perfect note to end on, almost as if we planned it.
Exactly. One of us did anyway.
Well, I'm sure, yes. This has been wonderful, David. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.